In the years following the American Revolution, while the new United States celebrated its independence from Britain, another war was brewing in the wilderness beyond the Appalachian Mountains. This conflict would rage for a decade, from 1785 to 1795, claiming thousands of lives and determining the fate of an entire continent. Yet today, most Americans have never heard of the Northwest Indian War, one of the most brutal and decisive conflicts in our nation's early history. The war began not with a declaration or a single battle, but with the relentless westward push of American settlers into lands that had been home to Native American tribes for countless generations. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 had officially ended the Revolutionary War, but it had also granted the United States vast territories northwest of the Ohio River. To the native peoples living there, this meant nothing. No European power or American government had the right to give away their ancestral homelands. The Northwestern Territory, as Americans called it, was a land of dense forests, meandering rivers, and fertile plains that stretched from the Ohio River to the Great Lakes. For the Miami, Shawnee, Delaware, Ottawa, Ojibwe, and dozens of other tribes, this was not empty wilderness waiting to be claimed. It was home. Their villages dotted the landscape, their hunting grounds sustained their people, and their sacred sites connected them to ancestors going back thousands of years. But to the young American nation, struggling with massive war debts and the need to reward Revolutionary War veterans, this territory represented salvation. The Continental Congress had promised land grants to soldiers in lieu of payment, and thousands of settlers were already streaming across the mountains, hungry for cheap, fertile farmland. The collision between these two worlds was inevitable, and when it came, it would be devastating. Leading the native resistance were three extraordinary war leaders whose names should be remembered alongside any great military commanders in American history. Little Turtle of the Miami was a brilliant strategist who understood both traditional native warfare and European military tactics. Blue Jacket of the Shawnee was a charismatic leader who could unite diverse tribes under a common cause. Buckingahelas of the Delaware was a fierce warrior whose very name struck fear into American settlers. These leaders faced an almost impossible task. The United States had emerged from the Revolution as a continental power with vast resources and a growing population. The native tribes, despite their skill in warfare and intimate knowledge of the terrain, were outnumbered and outgunned. Worse, they were divided among themselves, with some tribes choosing to negotiate with the Americans while others prepared for war. The conflict began with raids and counter-raids along the frontier. American settlers pushed into native lands, building cabins and clearing forests for farms. Native war parties struck back, attacking isolated settlements and supply convoys. The violence escalated rapidly, with atrocities committed by both sides. Families were massacred in their homes. Prisoners were tortured and killed. The frontier became a landscape of terror where neighbors could not trust neighbors and death lurked behind every tree. President George Washington, despite his desire for peace, was under enormous pressure from Western settlers and land speculators to open the Northwest Territory for settlement. In 1790, he authorized the first major military expedition against the Native Confederation. Brigadier General Josiah Harmar led an army of 1,453 men, a mix of regular soldiers and militia, into the Ohio wilderness. Harmar's expedition was a disaster from the start. His troops were poorly trained, inadequately supplied, and completely unprepared for the type of warfare they would face. Little Turtle and his warriors used hit-and-run tactics, striking fast and disappearing into the forest before the Americans could respond. The native fighters knew every trail, every river crossing, every hiding place. They could move silently through terrain that left American soldiers stumbling and cursing. The climax of Harmar's campaign came in October 1790, when his forces were ambushed and routed by Little Turtle's warriors. Over 200 American soldiers were killed or wounded. The survivors fled back to Fort Washington, modern-day Cincinnati, in complete disarray. The defeat was a humiliation for the young American military and a tremendous victory for the Native Confederation. But Washington was not deterred. If anything, the defeat made him more determined to crush Native resistance. In 1791, he authorized an even larger expedition under the command of Major General Arthur St. Clair, the governor of the Northwest Territory. St. Clair assembled an army of over 2,000 men, the largest force the United States had ever sent against Native Americans. St. Clair's army was a motley collection of regular soldiers, militia, and civilian contractors. Many of the men were recent immigrants who barely spoke English. Others were debtors and criminals seeking to escape their pasts. Discipline was poor, supplies were inadequate, and morale was low. But St. Clair was confident that sheer numbers would overwhelm the native forces. The native leaders, meanwhile, had been preparing for this moment. Little Turtle, Blue Jacket, and Buckingahelas had united over 1,000 warriors from multiple tribes. They had studied American military tactics, gathered intelligence on St. Clair's movements, and chosen their battlefield carefully. They would not meet the Americans in open combat where superior numbers might prevail. Instead, they would use the forest itself as their weapon. On the morning of November 4, 1791, St. Clair's army camped along the Wabash River in present-day Ohio. The soldiers were cold, hungry, and homesick. Many had deserted during the long march through the wilderness. Those who remained huddled around their fires, unaware that hundreds of native warriors had surrounded them in the pre-dawn darkness. At sunrise, the attack began. War cries echoed through the forest as warriors struck from all directions simultaneously. The Americans, caught completely off guard, tried to form defensive lines, but the disciplined formations that worked on European battlefields were useless in the dense Ohio woodlands. Native fighters used trees and fallen logs as cover, picking off officers and breaking up any attempt at organized resistance. The battle, if it could be called that, lasted less than 3 hours. It was a massacre. St. Clair himself was wounded multiple times but somehow survived. His army disintegrated as soldiers threw down their weapons and fled in panic. Those who could not run fast enough were killed where they stood. When the smoke cleared, over 900 American soldiers lay dead or wounded. It was the worst defeat ever inflicted on the U.S. military by Native Americans, and proportionally one of the worst defeats in American military history. The victory at what became known as St. Clair's defeat sent shockwaves through the young nation. In Philadelphia, President Washington reportedly flew into one of his legendary rages when he received news of the disaster. Congress launched investigations. Newspapers demanded answers. The survival of the United States as a continental power seemed to hang in the balance. For the Native Confederation, the victory was both triumphant and tragic. They had proven they could defeat the best armies America could send against them. Warriors returned to their villages with captured weapons, horses, and supplies. Children heard stories of the great victory that would be told for generations. But the leaders knew this would not end the conflict. If anything, it would make the Americans more determined to destroy them completely. Little Turtle, perhaps the most perceptive of the native leaders, understood that military victories alone would not save his people. The Americans had vast resources and an endless supply of settlers hungry for land. He began to advocate for negotiations, hoping to secure at least some portion of their ancestral territories through treaties rather than warfare. But many warriors were not ready to give up the fight. The victories over Harmar and St. Clair had proven that American armies could be defeated. Blue Jacket and other war leaders argued for continuing the resistance, believing that more defeats would eventually force the Americans to abandon their expansion plans. President Washington, meanwhile, was determined not to suffer another humiliation. He turned to one of his most trusted generals, Anthony Wayne, known as Mad Anthony, for his aggressive tactics during the Revolutionary War. Wayne was given command of a new army, called the Legion of the United States, and orders to end the native resistance once and for all. Wayne was everything his predecessors were not. He was a professional soldier who understood that fighting native warriors required different tactics than fighting European armies. He spent 2 years training his troops, teaching them woodcraft, marksmanship, and small unit tactics. He established a chain of forts to secure his supply lines and protect his flanks. Most importantly, he treated his soldiers as professionals, ensuring they were well-fed, well-equipped, and well-disciplined. The Legion of the United States that Wayne assembled was unlike any American force that had entered the Northwest Territory. These were not reluctant militia or pressed immigrants, but career soldiers who had trained specifically for frontier warfare. They could march silently through forests, fight from cover, and maintain discipline under fire. Wayne had learned from the disasters that befell his predecessors. As Wayne's army advanced through Ohio in 1794, the Native Confederation faced internal divisions that would prove fatal. Little Turtle, recognizing the quality of this new American force, urged his fellow leaders to seek peace while they still held some bargaining power. But many warriors, flushed with previous victories, demanded one more battle to drive the Americans back across the Ohio River forever. The decisive confrontation came on August 20, 1794, at a place the Americans called Fallen Timbers, where a tornado had knocked down hundreds of trees, creating a natural fortification. Blue Jacket and his warriors, confident in their defensive position, waited for Wayne's assault. They expected the Americans to attack in the same reckless manner as Harmar and St. Clair had done. But Wayne had studied his enemies as carefully as they had studied him. Instead of a frontal assault, he used artillery to blast the fallen logs where the warriors were hiding. His disciplined troops advanced in coordinated waves, using covering fire and tactical movement. For the first time in the war, American forces fought with the same skill and intelligence that had made the native warriors so effective. The battle was fierce but brief. The native warriors, caught off guard by Wayne's tactics, were forced to retreat. Many fled to a nearby British fort, expecting support from their old allies. But the British, not wanting to risk another war with the United States, closed their gates and refused to help. It was a bitter betrayal that marked the end of effective native resistance in the Northwest Territory. The defeat at Fallen Timbers broke the spirit of the Native Confederation. Without British support and facing an increasingly professional American military, continued resistance seemed hopeless. One by one, tribal leaders began seeking separate peace agreements with the United States. The war officially ended with the Treaty of Greenville in 1795. Little Turtle, Blue Jacket, and other native leaders were forced to cede vast territories to the United States, keeping only small reservations in what is now western Ohio and Indiana. The treaty opened most of present-day Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and parts of Michigan to American settlement. For the native peoples of the Northwest Territory, the treaty was a catastrophe disguised as peace. They had lost not just a war, but their entire way of life. Within a generation, most would be forced to move west of the Mississippi River, leaving behind the graves of their ancestors and the lands that had sustained them for thousands of years. But the treaty's significance extended far beyond the immediate participants. The Northwest Indian War had determined that the United States would become a continental nation stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The defeat of the Native Confederation removed the last major obstacle to westward expansion, setting the stage for the massive population movements of the 19th century. The war also established patterns that would be repeated again and again as America expanded westward. Native peoples would resist encroachment on their lands. The U.S. military would suffer initial defeats due to unfamiliarity with the terrain and tactics. Eventually, superior resources and numbers would prevail, leading to treaties that ceded more native land to American settlers. Little Turtle spent his remaining years as a celebrity of sorts, traveling to eastern cities where he was received by presidents and society leaders as a noble savage who had made peace with civilization. He died in 1812, still advocating for his people's rights but knowing that the world he had fought to preserve was gone forever. Blue Jacket continued to resist American expansion, eventually joining Tecumseh's Confederation in the War of 1812. He died fighting against the Americans he had battled for over 2 decades, never accepting the loss of his homeland. The Northwest Indian War deserves to be remembered alongside other pivotal conflicts in American history. It determined the boundaries of the early United States, established the precedent for westward expansion, and demonstrated both the courage of Native American resistance and the ultimate futility of that resistance in the face of overwhelming demographic and technological advantages. Today, as we drive through the cities and farmlands of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, we travel through battlefields where some of the most significant fighting in American history took place. The forests where Little Turtle and Blue Jacket once led their warriors have given way to suburbs and shopping centers. The rivers where American armies once struggled through the wilderness now flow past industrial cities and agricultural towns. But the legacy of the Northwest Indian War lives on in the complex relationship between the United States and Native American peoples. It reminds us that the expansion of American democracy came at an enormous cost to those who were here first, and that the heroes and villains of history often depend on which side of the battle lines you stood on. The forgotten war for the frontier shaped a nation, but at a price that echoes through American history to this day.